Okay, so today we're going to talk about high dynamic range photography, which is kind of a specialized topic, but at the same time, when I first started teaching it, it was kind of an interesting way of thinking about processing photos and the way we deal with photography. It has since become something that's used very frequently in advanced renderings and that sort of thing. I can collect all of your prints in a little bit, so I'm not stressed out about it. But it's something that's used a lot in rendering engines like V-Ray. So those of you that have taken 136, you know we talked about HDRIs and loading them and that sort of thing. This is kind of the precursor to that in understanding what they are in the first place. There was an artistic movement for a while that kind of centered around this kind of photography before it was, quote, useful. Now it's useful too, so I think it's particularly relevant to talk about, but we have to talk about it in general terms for right now. So what is high dynamic range? Basically, it's a set of techniques that allow us to see a greater dynamic range of what they call luminances between the lightest and darkest areas of the image. And so why is this important? Why do we care about it? Basically, what happens when we shoot standard photographs is we have to pick, or the camera picks for us, a specific set of exposure levels. And so if we were looking outside right now, I could expose for the, I don't know, the Cal Poly Design Village stuff. But if that was the case, if I had a wide-angle lens that was capturing that, but also capturing part of the inside here, everything inside would be really, really dark. And the unique thing about the way our eyes and our brains work is that we can adjust very, very quickly from seeing, if we all quickly looked outside, we could see that in perfect focus. It's not dark. It's, everything's fine. And then I can jump back in here and I can look at any one of you and I can see you perfectly clearly. And it's because our brain and our eyes work really well at making those quick adjustments in terms of how we see things. Cameras don't work that way. So while we see, and the good example of this is we see a beautiful sunset and we try to take a picture of it. Good luck, right? Because it never looks, the sunset doesn't look like we see it because we can see this higher dynamic range. We can see what's in the shadows. We can see the sunset. We see all of this because our brains are constantly reprocessing depending on what exactly we're looking at. And so what is the purpose of doing this? We're trying to create a static image that's mimicking the way our brain can process and see things. And it takes some techniques to be able to do that, but we have the ability to do it, and we have the software that can help do it. So basically, why is to more accurately represent the wide range of light intensity levels throughout a scene. It's also to mimic how we see these particular images. Can you push it beyond what we see? Absolutely. I'll show you some examples of where it's a bit exaggerated. Tone mapping is the technique that is used, and so this is basically what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing it manually. There are automated programs that will do it for you, and I'll talk about those a little bit. Tone mapping is basically the technique that we use such that certain parts of the image are exposed one way and other parts of the image are exposed another way. And the technical definition of a way of saying that is to reduce overall contrast to facilitate the display of HDR images on devices with lower dynamic range. And it can be exaggerated, which we'll talk about down the road. It reduces the dynamic range or the contrast ratio of the entire image while retaining localized contrast ratios. So in one of these images, you might have a cluster of pixels that have certain contrast. And if we were looking, say, in the shadows of this image, like down in here, they would have dark and light pixels. Okay? If those were exposed correctly, we're retaining those, this up here would be way too light. But we want this to be exposed correctly. So we retain the light and the dark contrast up here, and we retain the light and the dark contrast here. We just kind of equalize them, if that makes sense, so that we could see what we want in the sky, but also what we want in the shadows. And so it'll make a little bit more sense as we go forward and we start to process how we do this such that you can see it. So we have some software choices for how this is done. Obviously, Photoshop, being the powerhouse that it is, can handle high dynamic range images. It has an automated action that has improved greatly in CS6 and also CC, which is the newest version of Photoshop, that will merge a set of high dynamic range images together, and it will give you certain options in the processing that will help to display the image. And there is a difference between using the newer CS6 versus an older one. You had to do a lot more steps to get it to look good. Generally, you're going to do some further post-processing, and this is a good place for you to start to learn what masks are in Photoshop, and we'll talk through that today. But the idea is that you're going to do a little bit of tweaking further in Photoshop. It's not technically a built-in tone mapping software. Usually if you want to do it, you'll buy a standalone plugin that will work either as its own software or as a plugin to Photoshop. So you'll send it to this software that does the tone mapping and then kicks it back out. The good news for all of you is that Photoshop's available on the lab computer, so we get to use it. And of course, if you have a Mac, you can do it there. The gold standard in doing this is a software called Photomatix. It's been around for a long time. It's kind of the best of the best at what it does. They have a plugin that works with Photoshop. They have a plugin that works with Aperture. They have a plugin that works with Lightroom. And if this is the kind of thing that you like and you start doing, you'll end up kind of in this software choice. There are other choices out there. I'll show you one more that's a free one that's a different choice. There are reviews of websites with here's the 20 different HDR softwares, which one's the best. This one always comes out on top, so that's why I include it. It is unfortunately expensive. That's the downside of it. If you want to play around with it, they will let you download it for free, and they'll put a watermark on the image, but at least let you kind of play around and see what it does. And you can get an academic discount, which is always a good thing. You guys should get used to right now as students always asking for academic discounts whenever you buy anything, because almost everybody offers them. So just get used to that. It's like you guys can get free Prime for a year or something like that if you want. There's a lot of that kind of stuff.
Do we get a discount on Photoshop?
Yeah, you can get academic pricing on Photoshop.
Cool.
Okay, so in an architectural sense, why would we be using it? This is not by any means an exaggerated, over-processed, high dynamic range image, but it's a good contrast because it shows exactly what I'm talking about. So we have the picture of the empty loft here, right? And if we expose it properly to see the inside, the windows completely wash out and we can see nothing. And chances are you've tried to do this before in photographing things, and you've noticed this happen, okay? The bottom here is a high dynamic range image. The interior looks very similar to the top photo, which is what we wanted. But if we look out the windows, and I know this is projected, so it's not as good as it is on the computer screen, but you can see the whole city skyline, right? And so this is a more accurate representation of what it would be like standing in this room, because we would see what the interior looks like and what's outside the windows, and we wouldn't get it washed out. So the true use of a high dynamic range image is for this kind of a purpose. Now, we can of course exaggerate them and start to push the boundaries and make it more artistic as well. Here's a bunch of Victorians in San Francisco. One of the things that you'll notice in high dynamic range is the more you post-process, the more moody a photo can get. The more the clouds seem to be exaggerated and dark and really kind of trying to tell a story almost. But they can get pretty good. The saturation of colors can get stronger. They're great for night shots, or they kind of have a glow to them, which can be advantageous depending on what you're trying to do. It could be something as simple as this, which looks like a normal shot, right? The difference being you're getting a lot more detail right here at the creek bank where it would otherwise be a little bit too dark. So you could post-process a very simple image and not even know that it was a high dynamic range image. But sometimes you want to do that sort of thing. When you get into the transitional periods, so when it's just dusk and you've got lights on and you've got a little bit of light left in the sky, sometimes high dynamic range is a good technique to use because you can not have stuff down here that would otherwise be completely black actually have some light to it, and so you can see some of the detail. So it's just different methods. Sometimes you can push the boundaries, right? This is very much the haunted house look. Not exactly what the house looked like in reality, but when you start to push the tone mapping, you can get it to be something that's almost surreal. And we can continue to push that envelope. You can see I'm showing you examples that are pushing the envelope further and further. This is, again, pushing the envelope a little bit beyond what is, quote, realistic. But they can be very pretty results. This is bordering on way over processed, but I wanted to show you kind of how far it can go. And so then this one brings into where are these used in reality. And Amina, I know this works and you understand this right now. For the rest of you who haven't taken 136 yet, when you get to 136, hopefully you'll take it. I encourage you to. It will start to make sense for why this stuff is so important. But when we have this high dynamic range image, right? In this instance, it's tone mapped. We can see it. It looks pretty, right? But we can also save this high dynamic range image as a different format. It's called an HDR format or an EXR format. And that saves, kind of like a raw image, it saves a bunch of information about the various light levels of that particular image. When we do something like that, we can then use this in a rendering software such that depending on the exposure or the time of day of the rendering software, the background will change, right? We'll get more or less light levels during that rendering. So we could actually expose the camera of the scene. Let's say we were taking a picture down a street, and depending on the exposure level of the camera, the background's going to change. So it's a really great thing when we get to advanced rendering techniques and that sort of thing. When we use those, they're coming from a full panoramic image. And so the next two, so today we're talking about high dynamic range. Next class we'll talk about panoramas and stitching panoramas together, and they work together. This is a panoramic image. It's a full 360, so if I were to take this side and grab it, and take the opposite side and grab it, and pull it and curl it around on itself, right? This edge would join up with that edge, right? Does that make sense? So it's a full 360. It also is a full 360 from here to the top, right? So basically, if I were to take this image and paste it on the inside of a sphere, it would look like the normal scene. So it's warped right now because it's stretched. But if we can imagine curling that back on itself, that's basically what this is. And that's, again, where it would be very useful in a rendering type because you'd have a scene and an environment around you. We'll talk a lot more about panoramics, but I wanted to at least point it out there. Capturing the sunsets and the saturation of colors and that sort of thing. A shot like this would never be possible to get this information here at the sunset and also have this exposed as well where you can see the detail underneath without high dynamic range. Sometimes it's just about seeing a little bit more detail in a particular shadow, right? This here, I know it's dark on the screen. If you look at the slides afterward, you can see that you can actually see all of the structure that's underneath this particular piece of building. So it's subtle, not designed to be over the top, but it's giving you a little bit more information than you could otherwise get, right? One of the things that I like to point out, however, high dynamic range takes 2 or 3 images, maybe up to 7 images, and combines them together. If you're shooting in a place where things are moving, there's going to be artifacts. So if we look here, this car is moving. We have double bumpers of that car from the 2 images that were shot, or 3 images that were shot. And the people tend to blur. You get shadows and artifacts. So that's one of the side effects of processing this way. So you want to be aware if there's moving objects that you're going to get that kind of motion blur happening as well. Sometimes it's just seeing a little bit more detail in a shadow. It can be very simple. Similar concept here. Right? Way over processed, but can be done. Right? And sometimes it's about kind of the look that you're going for, what you're trying to showcase. Example here, again about the water. Because you're combining those 3 images, you're going to get that blur. And so you want to just be aware that that's going to happen. So if I haven't shown you enough high dynamic range images, all you have to do is type into Google HDR images, and there'll be so many. Or go to Flickr and type it in. You'll see a ton of these. So I'm just going to start going a little bit faster because we've talked through a lot of them. Similar in here, the shadows would be black in this kind of a photograph without high dynamic range. This was one that was done with Photomatix, but it has the watermarks on it, so I included that just so you could see what the watermarks look like. Say Photomatix on them. So some of these at the end are mine that I've been working with. Again, trying to capture sunsets is a great place to try to teach yourself high dynamic range. You guys have seen this one before. I've used these as examples. Okay.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Is there any difference between sunset and sunrise?
No.
Where you capture
Nope.
image?
Exactly. Okay. So let me close this because I was just practicing. I'm going to open Photoshop CS6, and I want to make sure that I actually open it because a lot of times people by default get into CS3 because on these images the default Photoshop is CS3 for some reason. So I went to the Start menu here, and then I went to Adobe Design Standard CS6, and then I'm going to pick Adobe Photoshop CS6, which will open up Photoshop. Okay, so once Photoshop's open, if you were able in exercise 104 to take your own set of bracketed images, try those out. If it didn't work or you weren't able to or your camera didn't do it, if you go to exercise 107, so just go to Exercises, Digital Tools, Fall 2014, pick exercise 107. At the bottom here, I have the PDF, but I also have 3 HDR sample groups that are shots that I did that you can work with as well. Because of these samples, I also make a note at the bottom of exercise 107 that you don't need to comment on this exercise, so you're exempt from that. But I remind you to go ahead and comment on assignment 101. So you still have some comments, but you don't have to do it for this exercise because they're all going to look the same. So you probably want to go ahead and download sample group 1, 2, or 3 unless you have your own set that you want to play around with. Okay? I've gone ahead and I've already downloaded those, so now I'm going to go ahead and work through how to process these images. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to follow Photoshop 1.8 to merge the HDR images together. And I thought I had it pulled up. I'll go ahead and open it here just so I can reference. I do have a bunch of YouTube videos in this section that hopefully will help you work through the various options. There is a special note for Adobe CS6. Once it moved to that version, we have an advanced section that will help, and I'll walk through what's going on in that advanced section that will help in this processing process. Help for this processing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, and then under Automate, this is where I have the option to merge to HDR. And so there's a Merge to Hdr Pro. And it brings up a Merge to Hdr Pro dialog box. This is where I'm going to choose what files I want to process. And so I'll go ahead and click Browse, and we'll do sample group 1. I can hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and select all 3 of the images at once so that I don't have to select them individually. But once I've done that, I can say OK, and you'll see that they'll be loaded in here. Usually they're shot consecutively. The ones that I've given you as samples are all consecutive images, 86, 87, 88. Chances are yours will be as well. And once I've got those loaded in, I'll go ahead and say OK. And we have to give Photoshop a little bit of time, and you can see that stuff is going on over here. And that's part of the automatic options. And we'll eventually get to this dialog, which is the Merge to Hdr Pro dialog box. Okay? And so once we're in the Merge to Hdr Pro dialog box, we actually used to end up creating a 32-bit image. This dialog box will do a lot of the post-processing for us, so we can skip a few steps. If up here it's set for mode 16-bit, 16-bit is what we can actually use and display on a computer screen. 32-bit image is too much information to see, so we're going to want it to be a 16-bit, which is good. The method here is going to be local adaptation. You can play around with these other options. I've always had the best results out of local adaptation. Generally, the defaults here are fine, but I will come down here and play with the 2 advanced settings. So we have 2 tabs. We have advanced and we have curve. First thing I'm going to do is look at the curve. And so this is what we've seen before, like a curved dialog box. I could set up a curve here if I wanted to. The only thing I'm going to do is I notice that my white is all the way up here. I'm just going to pull the black value over a little bit there to about where the histogram starts. Okay? If the white value started over here, I would pull the white value this direction. Right? But I don't need to do that because the white value is where I want it to be. So that's okay. Let me switch over to advanced, and then I'm going to play with these other options. So we have shadow, which adjusts the luminance of the shadow regions, basically adjusts how much detail we can see in the shadows. So for example, if I bump this way up and we let it preview, I can see more detail in the shadows down here at the bottom. If we went all the way, we can get the most detail out of it. If we go the opposite way, the shadows are going to get darker. And so one of the good ways of kind of seeing what happens is to go from, can you even see this on the screen? Oh, it's amazing. The projector, you can barely see it. Hopefully you guys are doing this and you'll be able to see it a little bit better. Basically, the shadow slider makes the shadows darker or lighter, depending on what you want. The highlight is basically the same thing, but it's going to be for the light areas of the image. So we can make those lighter. Maybe that one we can see. Yeah, that one you can actually see. So we can go from nothing to being much lighter, which isn't necessarily what we want, but we can also drop the shadows down if we wanted the sunset to be a little bit richer or a little bit darker. So I might drop that down slightly. The vibrance here, this is basically to adjust the saturation. And so if we desaturate the image, you can see it's getting less color in it, going more black and white. If we go the opposite way, we're getting a lot more color. And so you have to decide what the right value is. Usually I kick that up a little bit. And then saturation is similar. We get more color out of it depending on what we want. You can push this a little bit too far, but you can get pretty good results. That was 0. Push that up a little bit more. Yeah, something like that. Once I'm done with those options, I'll go ahead and say OK. And we have to let it process, and we get my final image. Okay? I'm going to do this a couple more times with the other images just for practice so you can see me go through them. I'm going to go ahead and create a new document. So I'll go to File, New, say OK, and then I'm going to go to File, Automate, Merge to HDR. I'm going to Browse, and this time I'll pick Sample 2, just so we can go through it. Sample 2. I'm going to hold down Shift to make sure I select all 3, and I'll say OK. There's all 3. We'll say OK. Okay, and so once again, I'm going to play around with first the curve. Okay, so here's a good example of the curve. The histogram here, right, is a low taper on that side, is a low taper on this side. I'm going to pull the black value over to be about there, and I'm going to pull the white value over a bit to be about there. So I get white and true black in this image. Then I'll go to Advanced, and this is where I'm going to start to play with my other options, right? So if I don't like the way the shadows are being a little bit dark, I can bump those up. If the highlights are being too bright, I can darken them up if I wanted to, right? Or we can lighten them. Depends on what looks right. I know I want to bump the vibrance up, and I know I want to bump the saturation up. We get a little bit more. It might be a little too much on the green on the trees. Okay, and so once I like it, I'll go ahead and say OK. Okay, and then I process this particular piece. Okay, I can do it one more time just for practice. I'm going to go to File, Merge to HDR, Automate, Merge to HDR, and we'll do the sample 3. We'll go to Browse. Hold down Shift. You only have to do this for one image. I'm just repeating the process to help you. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Okay, and so I'll go through the same adjustments here. I'm going to pull this value, and pull that value. Like that. We're going to go to Advanced. The shadows really need to be lightened up because I can't see much of this face. Right? And then we'll jump backwards here. The highlights are too dark. Okay. Bump these up a little bit. Okay, and so I'll go ahead and say OK. So I've done this processing on all the images. Now, sometimes you get to the point where you have a final image and you say, you know what, there's pieces of this image that just aren't quite right. And so we'll take this one as a start. The ground in here is just a little bit too light.
and I'd really like to darken that up. What I can do is I can use a combination of an adjustment layer, which you've all done before, and I can use what's called a layer mask on that adjustment layer to control where in the image it's actually being applied. And so this is the other critical thing that we're going to explore today for the first time. We will cover this in a lot more detail down the road, so if today's a little bit tough, don't worry, we'll get there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new adjustment layer, and I'm going to concentrate just on what's happening in this ground, and I don't care what happens in the rest of the scene here. So let me go ahead and we'll do let's do a curves adjustment layer, and so I can go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. Okay, and I'll set my midpoint here. That's fine, and I want to concentrate on this ground, so I want to control and maybe punch up a little bit more contrast in that ground. And again, I'm working primarily with just the ground. So I've done that. I'm happy with it. But if we look at what it does to the rest of the image, it really darkens up, especially here. This is kind of a big black block now. Okay? I'd like for this curve to just apply to the ground right here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with what's called a layer mask to control that. And so if you notice here by default, when we created this curves layer, we have the little curves icon, but then next to it we have this white square that has a chain linking it. You guys see that? Okay? This white square is called a mask, and by default it's white, and that means that this thing, whatever it is, curve, level, adjustment, whatever it is applying to the whole image because it's all white. Okay? If, however, I click on this, and you can see that it puts a little white box around it. If I click on this, I can paint a different color on this white surface and choose what it applies to or what it doesn't apply to. And let me illustrate it, and then we'll come back and do it again. Okay, so I have this selected, which is my mask. I'm going to use the paintbrush, which is just a standard paintbrush, and I'm going to paint with the color black. Okay, so right now it's all white. I'm instead going to paint with the color black, so I make that my foreground color right here. It's black. And I need my brush to be a little bit larger, and I also want it to have a sharp edge for right now. So let me adjust the size up a little bit more. Yeah, perfect. And I've changed the hardness so that it's a very sharp edge, which goes to 100%. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting in black on my image. But since I have the layer mask selected, what it's going to do is not apply this curves adjustment to whatever I paint black. So as I paint, right, and I'm going to keep painting down. Maybe you can see it here a little bit. Can you guys kind of see how that's changing? Okay, I'm going to paint this section of the image, and now if I were to turn, see how this is turning black and white over here from being all white? Okay, that shows that the mask is working. If I turn this on and turn it off, you can see that it's applying only to a piece of the image, right, which is what I want. So let me go ahead and keep painting in black. And one of the challenges is always where you get to an edge. Like that. Paint down here. All right. And so now we can see that that layer mask is only applying to the bottom and is not affecting anything up here. Likewise, if I wanted the sky to be much darker, let's do something. Actually, let me switch here, and I'm going to illustrate it with something that's a little bit more dramatic. Okay, so let me go back to here because I think you'll be able to see it on the screen a little bit more. And this is not necessarily what you want to do, but I think it will illustrate my point better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new adjustment layer. So I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to do a channel mixer, and I'm going to turn the image black and white. Okay. Yeah. Paint it white, and it becomes the adjustment applies. So white, the adjustment applies. Black, it doesn't. Okay. So in this instance, I did a channel mixer. I turned the image black and white, and I'll go ahead and hide that for right now. Now again, it's applying to the whole image because my layer mask is all white. If instead I click on my layer mask, I go to my paintbrush, which is right here. I'm painting in black. Whatever I paint is going to turn back into color, right? And so you can see the little black piece there, and so this is going to turn into color. So for example, I could say, you know, I really want the sunset to be in color in this image. But I want the ocean to not be. Okay, so I painted up the sunset. This is still in black and white. But I've got a piece here that I accidentally covered, and it's accidentally blue. So I'm going to flip my colors and paint in white now, and I'll paint that over, like so. And now what I end up with is I'm taking the lower section here and turning it into black and white. I probably should have done this the opposite way so you can see it on the screen. I'm trying to adjust so that you can see it on the screen. So let me flip this for just a second. Paint this back to black and white. All right, and let me paint the lower section here in the hopes that you might be able to see this a little bit better. All right, so that's now in color, and this isn't. And so the layer mask here is different. White on top, black on the bottom. And so you can see how that applies. Okay? So this masking is this is early in your masking technique. We will cover a lot more detail. All I'm asking you to do today is to play around with an adjustment layer and then selectively apply it to certain parts of the image. A lot of times when you have an image, you're going to want to do several adjustment layers. So I have one here that's adjusting this section of the image. I want to make the sky a little bit darker maybe, so let me go ahead and go to a new adjustment layer. I can, by the way, use this adjustments, these buttons, to go ahead and do it. Let me do a levels adjustment. I want that sky to be a little bit darker, something like that, okay? Which totally screws up down here again, but I'll work with my layer mask, and I will paint with black, and I'm going to paint everything below here. So that that adjustment does not apply. Okay? Now, there's a little bit of overlap here on the horizon. Control plus to move in. You guys can barely see it. So obvious on my computer screen. It's right. Oops. It's right in here where I've got that overlap, but you guys can't even see it, so it's kind of what's the point. The point is that I'm going to have to zoom in a little bit and work right along that ridge. I can hold down spacebar to pan, so that I don't have little tiny highlights along the edge of this ridge. And we continue to walk our way down. Got a little canyon there. And back up. Anybody ever been to the top of Half Dome? It's a fun hike, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This is from Half Dome in Yosemite, by the way.
Did you stand over the edge?
I put my feet over the edge.
Yeah.
That was the best I could do. The going up the cables and stuff didn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
It was just the actual edge was a little
Yeah.
rough. I did stand out on that. You know that rock that people take pictures on?
Mhm.
I stood out on that. I just couldn't look over the edge. So anyway, I don't even know if you can tell that I'm doing this. I'm going along the edge and fixing this. But the point being, Control 0 so I can see everything. I'm adjusting the sky independent of the rest of the image. And so that's the advantage of working with these images. So I can do the same thing here. Let me do a levels adjustment and see if we can't punch up that sky a little bit more. Maybe something like that. Right, where the sky looks pretty good. I don't want it to apply to the rest of the image. So once again, on the adjustment, I'm going to paint in black with my paintbrush. We'll make this bigger. We'll paint this like that. Oh, you can kind of see that example. Okay. And so there's an example there against the sky where my brush has overlapped, and you can actually see it on the screen. So I'm going to need to fix that. If I went over like this, I can just flip my colors to white and paint that section. Like that. I can also continue to make my brush smaller and smaller. I can flip my colors and I can deal with just those little pops and trees. Flip my colors again, get in here, and kind of work my way along that ridge. So it's good practice for what you're trying to do. We'll do something like that. Let me go Control 0 so you can see it. Right, and there it is right along that ridge. And I can do the same thing up here and down there. So what I'm ultimately doing is really enhancing what the sky looks like without touching the rest of the photo. Does that kind of make sense for what a mask does? Okay. So for today, I want you to process to the HDR. Then I want you to do an adjustment layer. And do I really care which ones you do? No. Do I really care how the image turns out? No. So if the learning process is better by making part of the image black and white and the other part of it color, that's great. If you want to really try to make the image look the best you can, that works too. I just want you to experiment with these, really trying to adjust it, and making these masks. We'll talk a lot more about masks in the next several days, class days, so you'll get more experience with this, but this is one of the really critical things to learn in Photoshop, is how to mask and apply things to certain pieces and not to other pieces of an image. Okay? So for assignment 102, which you also got handed out, you'll see here that masking is also kind of the root of this based on what we're doing in terms of being able to make things disappear. You can see a bunch of the examples. The one that's on here was done by a student 3 or 4 years ago. Again, it's kind of a creative way of making something disappear. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to combine things that don't belong together, or you're going to make things disappear that shouldn't be there. So in this example, she took 2 photographs. The first photograph was of her standing against the wall. The second photograph was of her t-shirt hanging on the wall. And what she did was she carefully masked off herself and blended that image into the image of her t-shirt hanging on the wall. And so it's that combination that creates the surrealistic image like this that couldn't normally happen. And that's really what we're looking for. So it takes some creativity on your part to come up with the idea. That's why a lot of times looking at examples can help. You're welcome to look at the examples on the course website. If you go to Digital Tools and go to Student Work, you can look under Assignment 102, and you can see all the examples of previous Assignment 102s that people have done. Some of which are great, some of which are not quite so good. And you have to kind of play around with those, and you can look backwards in time through what other people have done. That one's particularly creepy. I will show you a bunch of other examples of what people have done, some of the really good ones, down the road on the 17th. I'll also talk about how people did certain pieces of this and which ones, that's kind of goofy. And which ones are being more successful and why they're being more successful. So we can talk through all of that sort of thing as well. So anyway, this goes back a long time in time, so you can go back several years ago and see what was done and that sort of thing. That was kind of bizarre too. That one's kind of good, you know. Anyway. So, there you go. So anyway, you can go back in time and kind of see how stuff plays out. But just start kind of chewing on that and start thinking on that. Okay? Are there any questions on this? No? Okay. So get started on your high dynamic range, and then if you struggle with the masking thing, let me help you with the masks.
So we will also need to post exercise 107.
You'll need to post exercise 107, but you don't need to make comments on exercise 107 because you're all doing basically the same thing. So you're exempt from comments. You're only posting one image, so there's no need for a gallery. You don't need to post the original images and then the combined image. You just do one image. So when you're done in Photoshop today, use File, Save for Web. That JPEG is what you'll post, Make sure it's set as your featured image as well as it being in your post, and you'll be fine.